Well, good morning, everyone. Let's start with prayer. Lord, I pray that today you will teach us something about how to adopt the patterns of life which are best for us, so that we can live life to the full. In the name of Christ. Amen. Well, quite often I work to the old adage of a 3-point sermon. And today I want to put out a challenge to you to work out the 3 points that I'm going to be talking about. In particular, I think this will appeal to those who enjoy playing Scrabble or watching Countdown if you know it. My 3 headings are words which are all 9 letters long and all start with an N and end with ITY. And the letters that need to be included in the gaps are shown at the bottom of the screen, with some of the letters appearing more than once. So I'll give you a few moments to start thinking about the words before I give you some clues. Well, if you've got the words already, well done, but please bear with me for a while. To help others, I'll add in a vowel which appears 3 times in the word. So let's try again, and I'll give you another few seconds. Well, if you haven't got them yet, I'll add in the rest of the vowels and give you another 30 seconds. Well, maybe you've now worked them out. These are my 3 points for today: non-entity, necessity, and normality. And to cover these, I'm going to use 3 stories of characters from the Bible, of which 2 were in our readings this morning. But first, some background to my subject today, which is time out. I recently read an article in the charity press which commented on the importance of wandering and pondering, saying that this had produced some of the most transformational ideas in history. It said, why don't we do more of it? We rarely come up with those really great ideas when we're working at a screen, racing against the clock, or trying to manage a dozen things at once. It's only when we free our minds and take time out to explore that we find the diamonds. And the article went on, yet even though we know this, few of us make the time, a couple of hours a day, a couple of days a month, a couple of weeks a year, fully set aside just to explore, experiment, think, to follow our own curiosity, to allow inspiration to find us. And even fewer of us make the space to get out of our bubbles and workplaces to look at the world and its challenges from a completely different perspective. Now, exploring in that way can be hard and sometimes scary, so we often just don't do it, preferring to keep busy looking at our social media or permanently listening to music blasting out, as is the case with all the white van men that I see. We just don't leave space or time for creativity. And the article concluded, we know that over the months ahead, the challenges we face will only continue to grow, and we can be reasonably confident that the types of thinking and ideas that we will need are unlikely to come from inside our offices, organizations, or systems. far more likely they will come from those uncharted spaces, but only if we make the time and space to explore and experiment. And that equally applies to us as Christians, if not more so. We need to seek inspiration from our great God. So the question is, do we take the time and space to create or discover something or begin something transformational? If the world thinks that taking time out is important, what does taking time out mean for us as Christians? So let's start with my 3 points and see what the scriptures say. My first heading is non-entity, and it's based on the story of Moses. Exodus 3 tells the story of Moses and the burning bush. It says, Moses was tending the flock, and he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it didn't burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight. The first thing to say is that Moses was working. He was doing his job as a shepherd, tending the flock. But even when he was working, he took time out to explore something extraordinary. And the lesson for us to learn is that when you come to the mountain of God, as Moses did at Horeb, then something extraordinary happens. And when God saw that he had gone over to look at the burning bush, God called to him, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, here I am. And God said, don't come any closer. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. How important is it for us to take time out during our busy working days and lives to meet with God, our Maker? Now, this may seem odd to you, but when I was first made up as a partner, we had a partner's toilet. And I often used to take time out during the day by going to the toilet just to reset and refocus my mind on the God whom I serve. Now, in our passage, God told Moses, I have seen the misery of my people in Egypt and heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I've come down to rescue them. And then God told Moses that the way he would rescue his people was by using Moses himself. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go? You see, he thought he was a non-entity. He didn't have the charismatic personality he thought was required to confront Pharaoh or even to know what to say, let alone to lead the people out of Egypt. But in taking time out to check on something out of the ordinary, he had met with God, and he realized he had been chosen by the God of Abraham and Isaac to do something of value, even though he might need help to achieve it. He might have felt that he was a non-entity, but God didn't think that about him. But I wonder how many people here today feel like that. But you know, God says, I know even the hairs on your head. He knows you through and through. And if we are to meet with him, we need to take time out of our busy lives to come to our Horeb to meet with God. And as we do, we will realize that God has chosen us and he can do great things through us if we will but let him. The creator of the universe, the Lord and giver of life, has chosen you for a particular purpose. Whatever you may think of yourself, God values you as an individual, You are important to God. You are not a non-entity. My second heading is necessity, based on the story of Elijah that we read. Elijah was someone who worked his socks off. If you remember, he had the mother of all battles with the prophets of Baal, whom he had defeated. But then he came across Jezebel, who threatened his life. At that time, he was exhausted and he simply crumpled. And 1 Kings 19 tells the story of how he traveled 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God, which was the same place that Moses had met with God. And there he went into a cave and he spent the night there. And the word of the Lord came to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And he responded by saying that he had done some amazing things for God, but now he felt all alone. However, let's give him his due. He had taken the time out to travel to a special place to meet with God. But he was exhausted. And as a result, he had got the wrong perspective on life. He knew that he had to meet with God, his maker. God said to him, "Go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper. And when Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face and went out and stood at the mouth of the cave. So having taken time out as he listened in the silence to that still small voice, he was now ready to meet with God. Perhaps like me, you have periods of high intensity work. I worked in corporate finance for many years, and when a transaction was going on, it was all hands to the pump. The adrenaline kept you going. An intense period of work always seemed to end with a completion meeting finishing at 3:00 in the morning, and then you just crashed. And that's what had happened to Elijah. He was exhausted and he needed to take time out to meet with God out of necessity. So he made the journey to Horeb, just like Moses. He knew he'd had to take time out, otherwise he would crumple completely. So he went to the mountain of God and he stood on the mountain, experiencing all the elements of nature. But he also experienced the presence of God with him. And as he slowed down, he heard God speak to him and reassure him. And that's the case with us. When we are under considerable pressure, it's a paradox. We have to take time out to reflect and meet with God. Otherwise, we will buckle under the pressure. As well as taking time out each day, sometimes it helps to do something completely different, whether it's attending a Christian festival like Spring Harvest or New Wine. For me, I've often taken time out to visit Waverley Abbey for days of reflection and quietness. My third heading is normality, which is based on the story of Jesus. Luke 22 says, and I'll read this again, Jesus went out as usual to the Mount of Olives, and his disciples followed him. On reaching the place, he said to them, "Pray that you will not fall into temptation." He withdrew about a stone's throw beyond them, knelt down and prayed, "Father, if you're willing, take this cup from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done." An angel from heaven appeared to him and strengthened him. And being in anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground. And when he rose from prayer and went back to the disciples, he found them asleep, exhausted from sorrow. Why are you sleeping? He asked them. Get up and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. In this passage, Jesus took time out to be alone and to pray. Admittedly, this was a time of anguish for him just before his arrest, which led to the crucifixion. But in taking time out to be alone and with God, he was strengthened for the challenge that lay ahead. This is just one example of what Jesus did. But in Luke 5 and verse 16, it says, Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. The Mount of Olives was not a one-off. For Jesus, it was a habit. It was normality. He knew the importance of taking time out from his busy life in quietness, spending time in his Father's presence. And you know, Jesus couldn't fulfill his role without taking time out regularly. So if it was normality for Jesus, how much more is it vital for us? We need to take time out from work, or from studying, or from social media, or other things. In other words, time out to be with God. So our preaching series this January has been entitled Healthy Habits for Healthy Living, and today's theme has been about taking time out. Let me say that time out is not the same as Sabbath, although Sabbath involves taking time out to refocus on God. Taking time out may be a few minutes a day, or a couple of days a month, or even a week a year. It may be setting aside time out from work, or it may be after a stressful time or post an adrenaline rush. But in reality, it needs to be a pattern for life, because that is the way that we will notice the difference resulting from meeting with God. A former colleague of mine recently reposted a message he had seen on LinkedIn about someone who had taken time out to walk the pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela, which I know some of you in our congregation have walked. It said this: I spent a surprising amount of my hike crying. I wondered if I was doing this pilgrimage right. However, the simple but challenging task of long walks in solitude and surrounded by natural splendor unlocked something inside of me. As I walked and I wept, something happened to me. My friends, if we will only take time out in silence and solitude ourselves, then something will happen to us. And referring back to that article from the Charity Press that I mentioned at the outset, if we don't take time out, we will not be able to properly express the innate creativity that is within us, because we are made in the image of a creator or creative God. Nor will we be able to come up with creative solutions to deal with the needs of our local community, or even the needs of the country and the world. However, if you do take time out to be with God, you will learn that you are not a non-entity in God's eyes. He will lift you up and use you to fulfill his purposes. If you're open to it, you will learn to understand the times when you have to take time out of necessity, because then God will give you rest and a new direction. But really, we need to learn from Jesus that taking time out should be normality for us. Time in silence and solitude, meeting with God. And as we do, we will be strengthened for all that lies ahead in our lives. So the challenge for each of us today is, what do you need to do to make that happen? In the name of Christ. Amen.